Welcome to EmpowerU. I'm Amy Stevens. You may have heard Pastor Steve's podcast where we had a conversation about public policy engagement or civic engagement. You know, COVID changed a lot of things in our community, and this is where the road really exploded in membership and where people began to get engaged. And so Pastor Steve came to me and said, hey, would you consider volunteering to help lead this effort? We have all kinds of views in our church, diverse views. And really, how do we make sense of that? How do we move forward? People are exhausted, a lot of people angry, some just trying to raise their kids. How do we stay engaged? And I'm convinced it's through big, important little things that you and I can do every day. And that's what you're going to hear on these podcasts. You're going to hear from people in the community, school board members. You're going to hear from people that work in the pro-life space. You're going to hear from legislators, people that are going to talk to us about what their lives are really like, what their jobs are really like, and actually how we can make a difference and or support them. And so that is the hope for Pastor Steve. That's the hope that I have, and we look forward to engaging with you. My guest today is Eli Bremer. Eli is actually native Coloradan. I've known him for many years and so happy you're here. He is a former Olympian. He's a U.S. Air Force Academy grad. He ran for U.S. Senate, where he was endorsed by a majority of county commissioners. His wife, Cammie, is a county commissioner. In fact, she's chairman of the board right now. But he has an amazing story also about his son, Struthers, who was born weighing 1.5 pounds.
1.5 pounds, yep.
Oh my gosh, okay. But you also come from a long line in terms of family engagement, policy engagement. Your dad, Duncan, was a former county commissioner. Your uncle, Paul Bremer, was also appointed by former President Bush as the presidential envoy to Iraq in 2003. You've played a really big role in this whole issue of women's sports, transgender, men engaging in women's sports, the exposing in terms of athletes, and the governance of the U.S. Olympic Committee. You also, however, and one thing I was very happy about, and you waded in the water. You were our former El Paso County party chairman.
And I'll never get those 2 years of my life back, Amy.
You never will. That's exactly right. You were our former party chairman in El Paso County. And that in and of itself is a bravo. That's a tough job. It is a tough job. And you and I have talked a lot about this. We've been talking about the blue state in the time you and I've known each other, even in the time I served in office, right? The bluing of Colorado. And what are we going to do about it? And we kind of lament it sometimes. What's going on? Where I want to go, and I'll give you a scenario. You know this well. As you were running for U.S. Senate, I think our Congressman, Doug Lamborn, for the 5th CD was running. We were also going through redrawing of the boundary lines here in Colorado, everywhere. Redistricting. Here at our church, and Pastor Steve and I have talked a lot about this, we had a lot of backing and forth. We had a lot of people all over the map here at our church. Not that I would probably say a majority in this body are registered Republican and or independent, but probably Republican. And a lot of why would you vote for a compromiser? Why the buzzwords, the establishment, right?
Yeah.
And we would just go, I remember I got voted off the island on one chat group I joined, and then it was pretty clear where they were going, right?
Yeah.
And pretty clear where I was. And they were just, the group shut down because they were asked too many questions. It was kind of ridiculous. But this is what we have going on in every church. And this is what we have going on in our party. And about a few weeks ago, I got a resolution. I'm a precinct committee person. I got a resolution by the Republican Party in regards to the fundamental principles of our party, which wonderful. We all want, everybody wants principles. And it really revolved around the Constitution, right? The Bill of Rights, the 2016 Republican Party platform, I would go, well, okay. I mean, that's fine. I'm there with you. I will support that.
Right.
I was a political appointee at HHS in administration. And then it just says, be it resolved that the El Paso County Republican Party, that any elected Republican official and any candidate that aspires to elected office be firmly, openly, unequivocally, unashamedly demonstrative in support of our fundamental principles.
Yeah. So, Amy, the question is actually then who gets to adjudicate that?
Right.
And when I was elected chair, I was the youngest chairman in the state of Colorado.
Right.
I was younger at the time and naive, and I thought, here I am. Yeah, people really asked me to serve. I was an Olympian, Air Force grad. I was separated from active duty.
Yeah.
And boy, did I get a wake-up call real fast when I realized that was the fundamental question of who gets to do the adjudication.
Yes.
And when I was chairman, I coined the term the party Pharisees because I realized there was an entire class of people who acted like the Pharisees of the Bible. And they said, we get to determine the law, the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Right.
And they went so far off the rails that they convicted Jesus and executed him. They literally convicted the Messiah.
Right.
And I hate to say it, but this is a problem we see in politics.
Right.
Is that you have self-declared adjudicators of the law. And I've seen that. Unfortunately, I've seen it for years, and I think this is partly why we're slipping away. In the same way that the Pharisees of the Bible were driving the Jewish people, further and further away from God. I think the Pharisees in politics drive us further and further away from electoral victories.
I think today, you and I have had this conversation with our party, but actually I'm seeing it also in the Democratic Party now.
Yeah.
In other words, my former lobbying partner was kicked out of the Hispanic caucus. He wasn't La Raza enough for them. And I mean, he is as up and coming a leader as anybody. And I said, wait, what? You've got to be kidding.
Amy, I think particularly as Christians, and in full disclosure, Steve Holt gave the opening invocation at my launch event.
Yes.
So I've known Steve for a long time and consider him a good friend. But I think as Christians engage in politics, first and foremost, let's remember, your faith surpasses everything else.
Right.
And if you engage in politics, it needs to subordinate to your faith, and that truth is truth and righteousness is righteousness. And I love hearkening back to when Jesus said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's." And oftentimes I see churches that get political. They lose their true north, and we can disagree on what a candidate is or something like that. But within the body of Christ, we need to be very careful to keep that. With that said, then it's also important to be wise. And there's a lot of organizations that I see surrounding various churches that get politically involved. I'll use an example. There's a pro-life group. I'm going to put this in air quotes. It's a pro-life group that attacked my wife because she was not pro-life enough. Now, my wife literally put her life on the line to bring our son into this world.
Right.
We were counseled minutes before she went into an emergency C-section that the safest thing for her to do would be to terminate our son's life, and that would guarantee her life be saved. She said, no, that's not an option. Okay. So,
but there's a group of people who say she considers herself or she's not enough.
So, we've financially supported pro-life causes. I spent, I think, 6 years, I was the MC at the Walk for Life. Okay.
Yeah.
And there was this group in town that declared themselves a pro-life adjudicator. And they sent out a survey to her when she was running for county commission saying, will you demand that all abortions in El Paso County are canceled? Now, you've been involved with the government.
Right.
Can a county commissioner cease abortions in the county? Do they have the legal ability to do this?
I don't know that they do.
They don't.
No.
And so she reached back out and said, I can't affirm that I will do this because I don't have the authority to do it.
Right.
They also wanted to know, will you attest that the county will not do any business with any enterprise that supports abortion or something like that? Well, there's legal and constitutional reasons why a county is unable to do that. Okay, those policies are decided at other levels.
Right.
And so,
and same, by the way, federal can also,
Yeah.
we deal with this all
so
the time.
For instance, a very particular example I looked at when this came up was the county is self-insured. So let's say that you're a county employee and you're in Boston,
Right.
and you have an emergency and you go to a hospital where they perform abortions. The county would have to, they have to pay your medical bills. That's the agreement you have.
Sure.
So you don't have any control over this. So from a logistical point of view, she looked at it and said, I'm not going to lie to people. I'm pro-life, but I'm not going to lie to them and tell them I can do things I can't do.
Right.
So she was attacked as not being pro-life.
Right. And by the way, I've had those surveys.
Yeah.
I've had them, and
they're gotcha surveys.
Oh, they're gotcha surveys. But there's one. I remember saying, how much have you given to candidates? How much have you walked for candidates? What have you done for candidates?
And what's really interesting, Amy, and you know this, but a lot of people don't, that this is predominantly driven by money.
Right.
Again, back to the Pharisees.
Yeah.
What was going on in the Pharisees' days? It was about money. It was about power.
Right.
And so I think it's important for people to be very wise and say, don't just listen to what someone says. Steve Holt, the pastor here, has many times said we should be fruit inspectors. We should inspect the fruit of what someone's doing.
Right.
And so, again, I'm not going to say the name of this group. It probably wouldn't be too hard to figure out. But this is a group that masquerades as a pro-life group. And yet what they do is they attack pro-lifers.
Right.
And then they send out financial solicitation emails to pay for the people that run what is called a scam pack, a political action committee that's a scam.
Right. And we've seen that on Second Amendment issues,
We've seen it on Second Amendment. Right. There's a major scam pack, one of the largest ones here. So, I think as we engage politically, it's important to be wise and to say, Jesus did not call us to be foolish and just to, walk into a situation blindly. He said, be discerning.
Right.
Look at the fruit of, what a business does or what a person does and judge it by its fruit. And that, I think that applies very substantially in the political arena.
Well, when you were party chairman, this is kind of when this whole I'm more pure than you you're not enough. Is what I call it, the you're not enough. I remember when the Tea Party was going on, and I was in office at the time, and I remember thinking, wow, okay, people are gathering around. This could be quite exciting. This could be, this could be helpful, frankly. But then it became very clear that the people that were moving and taking that over few had barely worked a day in their lives or couldn't hold a job.
Yep.
Or in my mind were even suspect in mental health. I mean, you and I would go, that's probably not a person I'd have on my team.
Yeah.
And we would say that's probably not someone I would go with. And eventually we began to see the party kind of taken over by this.
A number of years ago, this was right after my term, but I was intimately involved with it. We had a vacancy for a state Senate seat. You remember this? Where there was a recall election. And it was out of this group that they ran, the supposed Christian conservative candidate.
Right.
And I remember a conversation with one of my best friends who I was joking with him. I said, what do you think when we look at her background we're going to find? It turned out she wrote pornography. And so we had the Christian conservative.
That's right.
And we had had two former state senators who were part of this, I sort of call them the chief Pharisees, who were promoting a woman who wrote pornographic content as the Christian conservative candidate. Wow. And so, again, it's I don't think we can do enough to advise people to be wise and ask questions because, the Christians were supposed to support this woman and I'm like, well, wait a second, maybe I missed that section of the Bible where this is how we're supposed to act.
I want to ask about a conversation you told me you had with a former state senator, and you kind of went through the whole reasoning of can we agree to disagree or can we have a different opinion?
Well, and in this case, it was really interesting because, I know you've started the book, Getting to Yes.
Yeah.
And it's a great book. I'd recommend it to anyone. It was written, 40 years ago, and it's about how to get what you're trying to get out of a negotiation.
Right.
And they talk about the difference between a position and in your principles.
Yes.
Okay. And so I sat down with this former state senator who I'd been having issues with, and he considered himself the most ardent pro-life person. And I said, well, hold on a second. You've never actually passed legislation that affects the life issue. He said, yeah, but my voting record's really good. And I said, well, there's a whole different group of people that believe that if you reduce the number of abortions, you've saved lives.
Right.
Look at Schindler's List, the movie Schindler's List. Talked about the man who couldn't save all the Jews, but he saved some of the Jews. Now, frankly, if you're one of those Jews who was saved, you're probably not condemning him and saying he wasn't enough pro-Jewish.
Right.
So,
right.
That was when it really struck me what a disconnect there was, because he couldn't even see that other people might have a different opinion, that if you say I'm for lowering taxes and you cut a deal to lower the taxes by 5% because you couldn't get to 10%, that was better.
Right.
And that doing good was better than not doing good. And again, I harken back to, I think Jesus gave us some really great lessons. And, he talked about, collecting food for the disciples on the Sabbath. Would you rescue an animal out of a pit on the Sabbath?
Yes.
And one of the message of Jesus was, love your neighbor as yourself.
Yes.
And this is not some warm, fuzzy deal. It was very practical. It was go do good things.
Right.
And so I look at that and I say, personally, I believe that politicians who advance our values are more effective and do more for our cause than the ones who don't, and who stand there and say, I got this rating on, from some outside group.
Yes, this group. I get that.
And by the way, it was interesting because in that conversation with that former state senator, he was talking about these ratings groups. And I said, so where do the ratings come from? He said, well, they're objective. And I said, right, but who decided?
Right.
Well, it doesn't matter. They are objective. And I said, no,
they're not.
And Amy, let's be very clear, because I think it's important for people to understand this.
Sure.
A lot of these groups who do ratings, so if you're looking at someone's ratings, a lot of the groups that do ratings are special interest groups that are making money off this.
Right.
So what do? They've got a couple candidates who they sort of own, or a couple of elected officials.
Right.
And then there's oftentimes two sides of every vote, and there's a reason why a good person might vote one way or the other. So what they do is they say, okay, we need to bolster this person, and this person. Mm-hmm. And so we start with whatever they did was correct, and we back into
or we list a bill and we say this guy was the champion.
Correct.
Right? He was the champion on this bill. And yes, everything from there.
And so, when you look at these rating systems and things like that, realize there's people behind them, and you didn't elect those people. You probably don't know who they are.
Right.
But I pretty much guarantee you they're making money off of it.
Right. And they all think the same way. And there is an inherent bias in everything they do.
And as much as I hate to say it, a lot of it comes down to money making.
Yes.
So, and you've been around as long as I have.
Well,
We've seen that where there's this person behind the scene who couldn't cut it in their business life. Right. So they come in, they create this rating system.
Exactly.
They judge, oftentimes good people, and then they make money off.
Right. And we wonder then why we cannot find or have a bench enough of good candidates who will actually get in the game to run, because they don't want their own party running against them. And the idea that we have some of this going on right now has forced some candidates to have to pay to get on the ballot, to pay for signatures because their own party works against them. And I wish, anybody living in another state has got to start seeing this is the road to completely and totally losing your power. Completely. I mean, it saps majorities. I had a guy, I was at a conference and he came up to me, he's from South Carolina, and he was talking about infighting there, and that he's so worried about it because people are making crazy connections and in a way skewering each other, doing them in. It's why we say during the presidential campaigns, why not 16 Republicans? Let's jump in the race so you can skewer each other while the Dems just sit back, have one candidate. They don't do anything else. I mean, to me, if people could look at Colorado and see how that has so worked against us, right?
Yeah, it was funny. I don't remember who said it, but it was very clever. They said, if someone were to do a postmortem on the Republican Party in Colorado, it would be ruled a suicide, not a homicide.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I hate to say it, but some of that has come out of the church.
Yeah.
I think I love what I see out of this church. The church I attend is also very grounded.
Yeah.
The pastor does a great job of saying, here's what the truth is.
Right.
You figure it out. Here's what the Bible teaches about sexuality. Here's what it teaches about abortion, and you figure it out from there.
Right.
And those, I think that begets Christians who get involved and really understand better how to engage. We also see on the flip side of that, people who get really revved up, and divisiveness is not something we see around Jesus in the New Testament. We see not him causing it. I mean, he sometimes ends the fight, but not starts it. And he doesn't, when the disciples came to him, remember the disciples come to him at one point and said, Jesus, there's people over here acting in your name, doing good things, and we should stop them. And he said, why?
Right.
They're doing good things.
Right.
Let them keep doing good things.
Yes.
And yet we see that culture, unfortunately, that culture has taken hold at the highest levels in Colorado right now of if you're out trying to defend life, if you're out trying to protect women's sports, if you're out trying to cut taxes or protect guns, but you're not in our faction and we don't get to control you, then we're condemning you.
Right, exactly. I remember as majority leader, I had someone from the other across the aisle, Democrat, come over and say, hey, listen, there's a few of us here that are deeply religious Catholic. And if you wanted to run a late term, an anti-late term abortion bill, we'd be with you on it. And
that would never be allowed in the Republican Party.
Well, it wasn't allowed. We floated the idea. The speaker and I, we said, great. We're happy to do that. We think again we'll be cutting back. And again, you had a faction that said, if you do that, you're not pro-life because then you're approving. Anything below 24 weeks is okay. And we said, how did you get there? Not at all, people. But we have an opportunity, other side of the aisle, joining, right?
To have a positive impact.
To have a positive impact. Well, nope,
Amy,
not having that.
If let's rewind. If our founding fathers had taken this approach, we never would have created this great country.
Right.
Slavery never would have ended.
Right.
When the Constitution was passed, slavery was still an issue. And there were a number of our founding fathers that understood how bad slavery is and that it's a terrible thing. It had been going on for the history of society, but it was wrong. And yet, because of the approach that they took, they said, we're not going to be able to end it today. But you know what? They ended it 75 years later. And that was, that was a high watermark for America that they did this. And I think that's a great path for us to look at and say, we're not going to win everything tomorrow.
Right.
But can we make our state a better place? Can we get it back to our core values that we agree on? Can we get back to the point of individual liberties, of personal responsibility, of respecting life?
Right.
Respecting that women should have their own bathrooms in sports. If we say it has to be there tomorrow or we give up, well, we're not going to get there tomorrow.
Exactly. No, and to undo so many, and I mean, the federal government, of course, is the absolute worst example. But people tried, right? As a political appointee, you try to undo some things. You try that, and it takes forever. I just have to say, if we cut literally half of all these departments, no one would miss a thing. Right. And really, I wouldn't miss a thing. And we began to see just to get the minutest thing done. And, I have to say, we had a president who kept pushing and pushing and saying, we have to get this done. We're going to get this done. No one's taking off till it gets done. There's merit in that in government. And I think so few people understand that sometimes it's the getting to yes that you talk about in the gray areas. You're not going to get everything you want.
No, and you know what? It's interesting to me that people talk about our founding fathers and practically deify them politically.
Right.
And yet our founding fathers said we built the government around having to compromise. And so, our founding fathers would get kicked out of the Republican Party today.
Right, and Reagan.
Would be kicked out, And what they meant by that is that the process is built around that. And so you don't have to like it or not. There's no morality to it. It's sort of like saying, my truck has an owner's manual and it says you need to change the oil.
Right.
And here's the type of oil you put in. Now, if I don't change the oil, eventually I'm going to have negative consequences.
Right.
So when our founding fathers built this form of government, they didn't trust human nature. They didn't want one group to have too much authority. So they said, we're going to set it up so you can never get everything you want. Now, that's a good thing because personally, I don't want the current people in charge of Colorado or our country to get everything they want. In fact, it would terrify me. And so, yet, oftentimes I see conservatives and Republicans who who say, well, I'm not going to compromise. And I say it's not a negative character trait to do that. It's understanding that the system was built that you're not going to get done what you need to unless you can find a way to work within the system to get something done.
Right. Right. Or raw power. I mean, now we're in the raw power days, right? We're in we're really past, at least even here. The same kind of thing we see in those subdivisions, we see it at the Capitol. And a lack of free speech, a lack of, our way or the highway, because that's what's going to happen here, people. And almost to, well, again, it's so oppressive. It is so authoritative. It is so, you think, oh my gosh, 10 years ago, that would not have been the case.
So, Amy, you know what's interesting is when you said that, I had to actually think which party you were talking about, because they both act the same way in that you've got, but one controls the levers of government and the other does not. And yet you actually just accurately described a lot of political figures.
Right.
And, if we're going to make the changes we want to make and that the church body tends to want to see done, we're going to have to be smart about it. And I gave a speech last week to a county party, and they asked me to come talk and say, how do we move forward? And I said, one of the things that I've seen is that we don't engage other people. We do a lot of talking, but we don't do a lot of listening. And it was interesting. A gentleman came up afterwards and said, what do you read for news? And I said, I try to read all the news. He said, I only read Breitbart. And I said, I'm curious, how many of the people that we need to persuade only read Breitbart news? He said, probably none. And I said, how many of them are reading CNN? And he said, probably a lot. And I said, that's why I read CNN every day, because I want to understand what's out there. So I think we have a tendency to get very insular. And unfortunately, this type of thing, all it does is it feeds our gravitas, it feeds people's egos, and it says, I'm so righteous. It's the Pharisee thing.
Right.
What we really need to do is frankly have a little bit more humility about, we have great answers. We understand the biblical principles that can go into governance. It was biblical principles that led to understanding that all men are created equal, and that means that based on your skin color, you're still equal, which led to the end of slavery. Right. These are good principles. Right. Where do we see personal responsibility? It's biblical principles. These are things we want to bring into the government. And yet, if we go and yell at people and tell them how amazing we are, we're not evangelizing them into our cause. And if we yell at them and say, well, that person believes the exact same thing, but they're in a different clique, so I can't support them, then that doesn't help us either. Right.
And we saw that actually, not just at state convention, but we saw it in the county convention, right? People who said they were the Patriots, they were wearing some sort of little bracelet or something.
I can't tell you how many people I know who said they wanted to leave and take a shower after that. Now, God help us if you go into a church body and, when I go into a church, whether it's my church or this church, I expect to feel edified and to walk out and say, okay, my spirit's been fulfilled. And yet that was a general feeling that people had this year was they'd never heard the kind of foul language, the kind of vitriol of people who were doing this in Jesus' name. And again, I go back to what, I love Steve's deal. Well, let's be fruit inspectors.
Right.
And if, I attended an event that was hosted at a church a couple years ago, and I remember walking out of that political event hosted at a church and feeling like I would not have wanted my, at the time, 6-year-old son to have heard the words coming out of the pastor's mouth because they were so vile toward other Christians.
Wow. It reminds me, and I read a wonderful book this year, Kurt Schleicher's Militant Normals. Mm-hmm. I get the whole, how the rise up of people going, look, we're sick of you giving away the house when you get to Congress. We're sick of you changing. You were this way when you were here, then you got over there, and now you're just, I get that part. It's a great book, by the way. I highly recommend Militant Normals. And I also recommend Douglas Murray's The Madness of Crowds. And now I'm reading yours, Get to Yes. But I would say that in that, in fact, I remember this bill, odd bill, homeopathic bill. Every year, it'd come before us and everyone was like, nah, no one could come to agreement, right? I mean, it split every, the personalities on the House floor as you run it are really interesting.
Yeah.
But in this homeopathic bill, okay. And Colorado's big on homeopathy, natural meds. I mean, we're very east and west. And I remember the majority leader saying to me, because we had just switched in 2012, so we had just lost, and she said, "This thing comes before us every year. I think we need to get this passed." And I said, I agree. And it's so funny. We did get it passed, but we had ours on my side of the all over the map, some with, some totally against, and Dee's on the other side, some really with us, and then not. But we got it done, and you would, even today, it'd be called, well, that's completely compromising, right? But now here, could you and I agree on some benefits, the benefits of homeopathy for people who choose, right?
If
for
they want to choose to
their
do
children, yes.
That's freedom.
Yes, it is freedom. And so I always think about that because it really required us. She was on my side of the aisle working the votes. I'm on her side of the aisle working votes. We got the thing, but again, how rare that is today. How so rare.
It is, and there's, I also, on the one hand, I don't like it when a politician goes and they change, but that there's also something that comes about the longer you're in an activity, you grow mature.
Yeah.
The longer I competed as an athlete, the more mature I was.
Right.
And so it's also good to have, again, a level of humility. And if you have a question for an elected official, don't listen to the outside group. Take it to them and say, is there a reason for this?
Yes.
Because what I've discovered is that oftentimes there is a reason.
Right.
And sometimes it's that the law doesn't allow them to do it. Sometimes it's that they can't get done what you think they can get done.
Yeah. That's
my wife woke up one day to 300 emails in her inbox complaining about a development that had been approved in the city and saying, you need to block this. And some very angry people that were friends of ours who were sending her nasty letters. She had to get her staff involved and send out to every single person, we're sorry you feel this way. You should probably address it to the city council because it's not in the county. And oftentimes, again, it's easy to get angry. It's easy to get wound up. But maturity comes from spending time in something and truly understanding it. And one of the things that I still learn a lot, and I hope I keep on learning my whole life. I've learned to ask questions of people and say, why is this the case? And oftentimes you'll discover that it's not as simple as we thought at first. I mean, when you first got elected, you probably thought life was very simple.
Right.
And then
until someone
and then you suddenly realize, wait, this is a whole lot more complicated.
Oh my gosh. You and I were talking about Schwarzenegger when he became governor, and he said, there is no university anywhere that teaches you this with problems every day.
Right.
I mean, it's crazy.
Yes. And so, as people engage in the system, or you're trying to understand, is my elected official or is this candidate going to do a good job?
Right.
That's something to ask. And it's also important to understand, as people mature, usually that's a good thing. My son, who's 8, makes better decisions now than he did a couple years ago, but he's still 8, so he makes bad decisions.
Sure.
I point out to people who have this vitriol and say, this person's not identical to me, therefore I judge them and I'm 100% opposed to them. I say, I don't agree with every position I held 5 years ago. And 5 years from now, I won't agree exactly with every position I hold today. That's maturity. So if I don't even agree with myself over time, why should I hold somebody else to the standard of having to agree with me 100% of the time when I can't even get my own act together?
Well, what's so scary at the Capitol this year is to see people who really, literally from the House floor, when I'm elected, I'm representing 70 to 100,000 people in El Paso County, right? And I have, when I served, highly educated, U.S. Air Force Academy area, everybody retired military. So you better have an answer for why you voted the way you voted, because they're going to come and call you or email or
which is good. That's okay.
Good.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Exactly. And to me, I was thinking, you and I lived through some of the worst vitriol, particularly when you were party chair. I mean, really, that's when things also began to really turn. You and I know. I mean, we had the health benefit exchange, right? I didn't pass it. I didn't vote. Michael Bennett voted on that.
Yep.
And from the feds, it came to our state. Now, you either understand state-wide, it would be like abortion. If they said, hey, we passed it, it's coming to your state, now you got to decide what you're going to do, federal or state.
Yep.
Who's going to have the answer?
You had to make a decision based on your authority,
right,
and on what you could control.
Exactly.
And you
no handbook.
because obviously you and I were in massive amounts of communication at the time. This became a big blow up around the state. And I remember very clearly your logic was the decision, I believe, that is being presented is, do we let the federal government or do we have local control of our healthcare system?
Of our healthcare, right.
And I think if most conservatives were presented that question, they would say, oh, I think the local control is the better option.
Just like with guns.
Right. And if you're not given option C, which is neither of the above, which you weren't given, then you have to
But
you have to
people
do
wanted.
But they wanted that.
Right.
So
Unreal. And again, it looks so simple because you have people that don't think through some of these things. In other words, it's in a 2-second soundbite, right?
Yeah.
2 seconds. That's the answer, right? And it's kind of like saying I'm going to go back to the floor, House floor this year, where I'm elected to represent, but if I disagree with you, you're a hater.
Yeah.
You're a hater. And I've watched those in control of the Democrat Party go, no, I'm sorry, you disagree. In fact, people were even told the kind of verbiage they should be using. Mm-hmm. Someone got gavelled because he said the word, he was arguing and said the word Planned Parenthood, and they're like, they were gavelled. And he said, wait, what? They're a business. They're here. Another guy gavelled because he dared to talk about a resolution because he has 3 daughters. We're back to the sports issue. Mm-hmm. And he said, I'm not comfortable with what's going on. He's gavelled.
Right.
He's saying, wait, what? And so the question becomes then, does my representative actually get free speech as we're supposed to debate these issues on the House floor? I see that coming. I see that as a very big issue. You and I disagree. You're just a hater.
Yeah.
You're a hater.
Yep.
We can't. And again, we're back to how do we get to yes?
How do we get to yes?
Or how do we get to no?
And at a practical level, you don't get your policies passed unless you get a majority.
Right.
You have to have the votes there. It's something that I think a lot of people who even are engaged in the system don't understand true civics and understand how do these things actually work.
Right.
And the speech I was giving the other night, I said we've got to get back to understanding this stuff, because if we don't, we're just going to keep losing. So I remember I was much more, I don't want to say rigid. I was probably a lot more arrogant about my beliefs when I was younger. And it was 2008. I just finished in the Olympics, and Senator John Kyle was in town.
Oh,
and Cammie and I were asked to be, sort of his, and we had the president of the NRA was here. And so Cammie was sort of her body person, and I was Senator Kyle's body person. Great experience. We drove down to Pueblo for an event that was poorly organized, so we wound up leaving and coming back to Colorado Springs. And I called up some friends over at Focus on the Family, and we set up a meeting with Senator Kyle and Jim Dobson to talk about the election. So we were able to salvage the day. But we're driving up, and he gets a call from Susan Collins. And he says, Susan, it's okay, vote against me on this. And then he hangs up the phone, and I looked at him and I said, sir, what did you just do? And he said, I'm the whip. It's my job to make sure we have enough votes to pass the legislation. Whether it passes with 51 votes or 61 votes makes zero difference to me. But whether or not she gets reelected makes all the difference, because if she gets replaced by a Democrat, which is what would happen in that state, I will never get her vote. So, and all
people
of a sudden,
don't get that,
so
do they?
I call it my road to Emmaus. Like the scales fell off my eyes, and I suddenly understood, before that, I was like, yeah, I'm going to go get those rhinos. And, I would have been, I'd have been Paul. I'd have been the rhino hunter. If we're doing biblical analogies, I'd have been the Paul, like, none of you are pure enough.
Right.
And then, hearing from this, this elder statesman, how it actually worked.
Right.
And I said, I get it. We have to be smart. We can't just stick our head in the sand or scream in the wind, or whatever analogy you want to use.
Right.
And I hope that we can be wise as conservatives and Christians engage on the system and say, let's be effective.
My minority leader said, vote your district or someone will vote it for you.
Yes, that's very true.
No truer words, have been said. As a majority leader, we had to look at we only got the majority by 1 seat, right? Everybody thought it was them. We had to, say, no, it was not you. It was this guy, right? By 350 something votes, right?
Yeah.
So you're herding cats, but you always have to think okay, she is in a reelection position. She just barely won her seat. She cannot take the hit on this vote, or we need to, very often she would say, I'm going to vote this way. I feel this way. You were like, you do it.
And Amy, to put an exclamation point on that, the way you will never even bring a bill to the floor unless you have the power of the gavel.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
So let's be really clear. The second you lose that majority, you can't block legislation coming to the floor, nor can you force it to come to the floor.
Right.
And so if I'm scoring, I came out of sports and business and the military, so I tend to be objective in my analysis. In my business ventures, you're either successful or you're not. They don't give you an E for effort. Right. At the Olympics, they didn't say like, oh, we'll just put you in the Olympics because you gave it the old college try. You did a lot of practices. I had to go win Pan Am Games.
Right.
Okay, they made me perform on the field of play. No one cares. So in politics, the same is true. If you lose the majority, you can't push any of your agenda forward.
Right.
And so
some don't care.
Exactly.
Because they care more to tell people, I fought.
Well, because they make money.
Yeah, they make money.
They make money.
Back to that.
They make money when we lose.
Exactly.
So it's really important to understand that sometimes it's more like watching a game of football.
Yes.
Because, and I use that analogy all the time. If you're on defense, there are times when you're going to be on offense and there's times when you're on defense. When you're on defense, don't try to score touchdowns because the other team's going to score on you. Play defense well. Try to get the ball back. Try to prevent your opponent from going there. When you're on offense, don't throw Hail Marys every time. Move the ball down the field. Sometimes you're not going to get it across the finish line, but you're going to get it closer and you'll play the field position game.
Yes.
And you know who's done that magnificently are the Democrats in this state.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they have.
The Democrats did not run a bunch of radical leftists to take over our state.
No.
So, and Amy, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, because people, again, they sort of think, okay, one really loud, obnoxious person who speaks the truth that I believe is worth 3 who are not as loud and obnoxious. Well, that's not true. They're actually worth exactly the same votes. I believe that the level of change in the government, whether it's conservative or liberal, is not based on how vitriolic the people in the majority are. It's based on the size of the majority.
Yes.
Okay, because if you have a 1-vote majority, you can get very little done.
Yes.
And you will accomplish the center of your party. Okay.
Right.
So that's very different than if you have a larger majority.
Right.
And what the Democrats did in Colorado very skillfully is they elected a lot of people that were squishes, according to them. But once they had a large majority, they could lose 2, 3, 5, 7 votes.
Right.
And they were really governed by the left-turn side of their party.
Yes, they are today. I mean, very radical.
And so I think it's important for people to understand that if you want to see your values achieved, it's not achieved by having louder, more obnoxious, more vitriolic people. It's by having more people who generally agree with you holding those seats.
Yes. No, I agree. Listen, I want to thank you for being here today. These discussions are ongoing. I'm be calling you back, but they are. And, really seriously within our church, these issues are happening. And I think the whole Be Wise is very, very apropos for right now, as well as the get to yes. I think as I'm going through this book, I go, oh my goodness, how do we, it's not personality, is it issue, is it principles? Let's please get there.
And I think as Christians, we need to have people use discernment.
Yes.
Okay, it's okay to ask questions.
Right.
And when we're vetting candidates, it's okay to ask them beyond what's your view of the Constitution. It's okay to say, I need to know what's in your past because we have set up a system where a lot of times people say you can't ask those questions. But it's up to us as Christians to be wise and ask those questions. I wouldn't hire an accountant who had a history of embezzlement. Be wise, be discerning.
Yes.
Take your Christian values into the political system and use the lessons Jesus taught us. Just because someone says they're a Christian, it's okay to ask the question: Are they a Pharisee? Are they benefiting from this?
I don't think most Pharisees know.
I don't think most Pharisees. But
they didn't get the memo.
We saw that back in Jesus' day,
sure.
and people haven't changed much in 2,000 years.
No, true.
True. It was the self-professed spiritual people that executed Jesus.
Right, and as Steve will say, he's toward the kingdom of God, revolution. He wants to see this kind of stuff operating discernment.
And that's where we will make the most progress is when we're wise and discerning.
Yes.
And we say, say, the lessons we learn from the Bible, about the fruits of the Spirit. I look at that in politics and I say, how many times do I see someone who is purporting to be following God, and I say, I don't see any of the fruits of the Spirit in you. Call me crazy, but my Christian faith,
well,
advises me on
I'm
this.
still working on my fruits. I got a lot of them to overcome.
We all are. But to that point, again, I think Christians need to be wise, discerning. We need to pray about it. You need to, to test, Jesus said, test the spirits.
Sure.
And when someone comes in and tries to wave, these are my values in front of you, great, but test it.
Okay.
And be wise.
I like it. Thank you. Boy, always great talking to you. Thank you, Eli Bremer, for being with us.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.